Art, and then we're on. Take it away.
Thank you.
And I thought I would start off, since the theme here is freedom of expression, by trying to understand and ask you to introduce briefly why it is that you expressed yourself as you did in May of 2013 when you delivered this archive of secret documents to me and to other journalists. What made you do that?
It's a very interesting story, a very long story, but if we compress it, I grew up in the shadow of government, right? I was not a radical, I was not skeptical. I signed up to join the army after we declared war in Iraq because I believed the government's assertions, their attestations, that we were going to free the oppressed, that it was a just cause, that it wasn't, political, it was about doing the right thing. And I wanted to do my part. My father worked for the military for 30 years. My grandfather was an admiral. My mother worked for the federal court systems. And from the time that I left the Army, prior to that I was actually working in the shadow of Fort Meade, I actually worked for the CIA. I worked for the NSA as a contractor. I worked with increasing levels of clearance, because I thought this was a way that I could apply my skills to a positive end, to a good use, to protect the nation, to do the right thing, to keep us safe against real enemies, against real dangers, real threats that were existential, right? Because this is what we heard from the most senior officials in government. They said terrorism was an existential threat. And so I did my part, and I did my part, and I did my part. And yet something strange happened, and that was as I gained greater and greater access. I was promoted further and further up the chain, and eventually I find myself working at the NSA with the actual tools of mass surveillance directly. I realized that we weren't just tracking terrorists, and I found that, in fact, in many cases, the primary uses of the tools that had been publicly justified as anti-terrorism tools were actually being used for things that were completely different. These programs were largely about foreign intelligence collection broadly. And when you think about intelligence collection, that can be anything. That can be economic intelligence, that can be political intelligence. And this was being pursued in a way that had never been done historically before because we lacked the capability. Traditionally, during the Cold War, before the Cold War, we were targeting our programs to go after, for example, the Soviet Missile Corps, the movement of tanks and military arsenals in countries to see if they're moving towards borders, things that may indicate some sort of hostile activity. And these things were very narrowly targeted just to military units, just to foreign heads of state. But in the wake of September 11th, something extraordinary had happened in the dark that even people who had clearances did not know. And that was that there were special compartmented programs. You can think of these as sort of above top secret programs called exceptionally controlled information. One of these programs was called Stellar Wind. Stellar Wind was where in the Bush administration we had officials coming from the White House who conspired in secret without the knowledge or consent of the public to watch everyone without a warrant, to the best of their collection capability, to guard against the possibility that there could be terrorist activity amongst us anywhere. So we stopped targeting. We stopped watching people that we had an actual probable cause in traditional law enforcement means of investigation, or even a reasonable articulable suspicion to intercept their communications. And we began intercepting the communications of the entire country and the entire world as technological capability progressed. And this was fairly extraordinary because the Constitution explicitly prohibits the government from doing this. And everyone who works for the CIA or the NSA, on your first day, you come in and you're asked to take sort of an oath of office. It's called the oath of service. To defend not the president, not the intelligence agency, not any secrets. There is no oath of secrecy. There's only an oath of service. You say, I will defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And the Fourth Amendment of that Constitution says the government will not engage in unreasonable searches or seizures. And this is where the government and I came to a point of conflict. The government argued they could collect communications from everyone so long as they only looked at them when they had a good reason to do so. But the Constitution says that seizing those communications in the first instance is itself a violation of the Constitution. And this is largely
what I wanted to do here, Ed, I wanted to bring this towards the freedom of expression theme now. So secrecy is a barrier that prevents free expression. And there was a time when you were very much, at least as alleged in articles that identify you as a guy who used the handle the true hoo-ha on the Ars Technica board. You were a guy who thought that if someone spilled a classified secret, they ought to be shot in their personal regions. What did you believe then, and what changed your mind, sort of in a nutshell, about this?
I think there's a lot to this. So we're talking about alleged internet postings, which even if they were me, and there are a lot of indications to say that's probably the case, I couldn't actually own them, because then I'm encouraging everybody in the world to basically be held to account of things that they were posting under a pseudonym as sort of an anonymous identifier, which is really a core concept of privacy. But for the sake of argument, let's presume that's exactly what I said. And I think it wasn't actually the personal reasons. I think it was alleged that leakers should be shot in the balls. And this actually is sort of an indicator of what I said before, that I really was a true believer in government. I didn't have any skepticism at all, because it came down to tribal identity, right? It comes down to, what do you believe in? How do you identify yourself? And the language of the national security state, as we may say, is the language of good and evil. It's about good people and bad people. It's about the nation versus the adversary. And when you are brought into a position of sort of classified access, you believe that all of those people in the media, all of those protesters that are out on the street, all of the people who are complaining about the intrusiveness of surveillance, about the violation of their civil liberties in this context or that context, they simply don't understand what you understand, because you have access to knowledge and information that they don't have. But I came to learn that even within the intelligence agency, you don't get the whole picture. In fact, the most controversial programs are the ones that are reviewed with the least scrutiny, because they're known to the fewest amount of people. And this reaches a point where in the Bush administration he asserted a paradigm in which we'll call covert action programs, sort of the most sensitive activities, most secret activities in the intelligence community, aren't seen by everyone in Congress who has legislative oversight of the intelligence community. Instead, 535 members of Congress are replaced with 8 of them, called the Gang of 8. The entire circuits of all of our federal courts in the United States are replaced with a secret rubber stamp FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, that in 33 years was asked by the government to authorize surveillance secretly in new and novel ways, 33,900 times. And out of those nearly 34,000 times in 33 years, the secret court only said no 11 times, as I understand it. I don't think that would be the case in an open court. And ultimately it gets to the point where then we've got the president, right, who's making attestations and assertions, where in 2003, a journalist for the New York Times, James Risen, discovered that the Bush administration was engaging in the warrantless, indiscriminate mass surveillance of everyone in the United States. And he was going to reveal this in the run-up to the election. But the government said, if you tell people about this, people will die, right? This is a necessary program. It's a valuable program. It's saving lives. You'll have blood on your hands. The reporter didn't believe it. They went to the editor of the New York Times, and the New York Times editor agreed. He said, we won't run this story, at least not in front of the election, which deprived the public of its right to basically agree with these programs, to renew support for these programs, or to reject them and go in a different direction. Now, that story was, of course, famously reported, I believe, in 2006, because that reporter said, I'm going to publish a book myself.
Right. So this actually came out in 2005, but James Risen is actually kind of an interesting bridge here for me, I think, to another aspect of the freedom of expression debate when it comes to surveillance. Risen was involved in another case. This book you just referred to had a chapter about another case entirely. We don't have to get into the details here, but the government, in order to prosecute the man they thought was the leaker, demanded that Risen testify, and the government knew about who the leaker was because of their surveillance tools. And so one question I have is how surveillance relates to and can have the effect of suppressing free expression, and you've talked about this in the context of the Risen case.
This is one of the real things we're struggling with, because the government argues, look, these are necessary tools, or at least they're valuable tools. For example, that Bush-era program we were talking about, when it was eventually revealed and eventually reviewed by specialists who had full access to clearance, could interview the director of the NSA, they found that, in fact, it had never stopped a single terrorist attack in the United States. And they said it had never even made a concrete difference in an investigation. But still, the government says these are necessary tools. At the same time, they have extraordinarily high and novel impacts outside sort of the domain of intelligence gathering and investigation. And that's that if you're collecting the phone records of everyone in the United States, as we were for more than a decade, you have records of all of the phone calls that are coming in and going out of every news agency across the country. That's what happened in the Risen case. We saw that these had been used and abused by the United States. We also saw that these things had been used and abused actually in the case of British intelligence as well, where tens and thousands of emails were captured en masse of actual journalists. And of course, this wasn't revealed, it wasn't disclosed. But the question becomes, how can the freedom of the press work in a society? And the freedom of the press is our final safeguard against a government that is basically abusing its privileges, using extraordinary powers or secret powers against the public or for corrupt purposes. If you can't engage in investigative journalism, if you can't securely and privately reach out to a source and have that done in a safe way. And this happens all over the world. It's not just an American problem. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what was revealed in 2013. The broader story was not about the NSA. It's not about US government bad or anything like that. This is a global problem that we are all facing because of advances of technology and our increasingly lessened control over the direction of government in many different societies around the world. We could have, let's say a complete renaissance of oversight policy in the United States. They go, look, there's too much room for abuse. We recognize that we're gathering the communications of journalists, of students, of activists, of protesters in every corner of the world. And we recognize the fundamental truth, which is that abuse is a byproduct of power. If you grant an extraordinary privilege to an institution, over time, it will tend to be abused. Not in every case, of course, and typically not early on, but as they become acquainted with it, as a state of emergency pops up, the temptation to use the tools that they have to a greater or increasing extent can't be resisted. But if we had, well, hang on, just the one point here is, if we reformed everything in the United States, rainbows and unicorns tomorrow. Congress is completely trusted. We know they'll do the right thing every time. They fully represent the will of the public. The global communications network that we all rely on today, whether that's the cellular network, whether that's the internet, crosses borders invisibly and instantly and repeatedly every time you connect to a server, every time you send an email, every time you make a call. It's going through Britain, it's going through China, it's going through Russia. And every time it crosses a border, it crosses jurisdiction. We must find ways to enforce our rights through our technology that can be done in a global manner rather than in a patchwork manner, or necessarily we will suffer the loss of a free and open and effective press, because it'll simply be observed every time a journalist moves, every time they meet with a source, every time they write notes for a story.
So we're talking now about reasonable fears of consequences from too much surveillance and ways in which that can suppress freedom of expression. So let's take it off the plane of, sort of matters of state and fancy journalists, and think about a group of ordinary folks. Let's just say college students, and suppose that they're thinking, well, are there places I should worry that I shouldn't browse, or people I shouldn't allow to friend me, or jokes I shouldn't tell, or places I shouldn't visit? Would you advise them to be concerned about that, given the state of surveillance today?
This is a very deep topic, and we could talk about this for the rest of the time we have available. But if we try to unpack it in a fairly basic manner, the fundamental premise is that what the government describes as bulk collection and everybody else in the world describes as mass surveillance means that every communication that can be intercepted and stored is being intercepted and stored for increasing periods of time, because storage gets cheaper as technology progresses. Kind of like your new phone has more storage than your old phone, it's faster than your old phone. Surveillance capabilities follow the same trend. And so when I left the NSA in 2013, that meant most records that were being intercepted were being stored for 5 years, if they were easily compressible. I'm talking about associational records, who you talked to, where you went, when you went there, who you were with, activity records of your life. Not everything you said during your conversation, but everything you did. And this was being stored for 5 years. Now, the director of NSA could sign a waiver and actually store these things for much longer periods of time. And this trend is likely to increase and continue. What this means is that, and actually, if we go to other states, AT&T, for example, the phone company, has made more than 23 years of phone records available to U.S. government officials who are actually operating in AT&T call centers, just for purpose of drug enforcement, right? To help out the DEA and get a little bit of money on the side from that. 23 years of call records for some people who may be in this room is longer than their entire lifespan. That means if you use AT&T and have always used AT&T, you may have never made a phone call that did not leave a log in a government database. And so you go, all right, well, what do I care? What does it matter, right? And this gets us to the problem of, well, who is privacy for? And one of the challenges is we're asking privacy as a word to do too much work in the context of the current discussion and debate. Privacy is a foundational right. Privacy is really the right from which all other rights derive. When you think about things like personal property, that's called private property. That derives from privacy. Privacy in the modern context means liberty. It's what eventually Justice Brandeis wrote in the 1890 Harvard Law Review long before today, is the right to be left alone, to do what you want, to think what you want. It's all of the products that are of your intellect are yours alone. And it's up to you to develop your ideas and selectively share them with colleagues or adversaries and rivals as you feel they're ready to be shared. And this is fundamental because you think, well, what happens if we don't have that? Privacy is the mother of the individual. If you don't have privacy, you're at sort of the mercy of the majority in everything. Privacy is for the different. The majority does not need privacy. The most orthodox person in the world does not value privacy personally, individually, until they deviate in some way from the most common practice because they have numerical superiority. Everyone else is a majority in society, agrees with whatever it is. And you've got to remember that in many cases throughout society, that has been things like support for slavery, for segregation, for the prohibition of alcohol, the prohibition of gay marriage, the prohibition of marijuana. And none of these policies could have been challenged, could have been overturned. We could not have progressed from this point without people having the privacy to coordinate and debate, to create an argument, to organize into a protest movement, to gather support, and eventually win. And you can think about the fact that our country was actually born out of privacy. You know, in 1776, when the Founding Fathers, were thinking, how do we make this work? If King George had been able to immediately identify all of the ringleaders because he knew everywhere that every letter was sent, who they were being sent to, when they were traveling, where they would be at, where they were laying their head at night, the Revolutionary War would have been a very short war, and we would have lost. Now, in the context
what you're talking about now, actually, you're talking now about the famous metadata, right? Which the records about records, and my experience is that many people don't follow that very closely. They aren't quite sure what we're talking about. So you said the metadata would have been if every hand-delivered letter written on quill by quill pen on parchment, not that the contents had been read, but that King George somehow knew. Oh, I see. Jefferson sent this to Adams on this date and time. Explain metadata.
So let's simplify what metadata is, right? Because the government says you have no Fourth Amendment interest in the metadata of your communications. If the FBI or the NSA or anybody else wants to suck up absolutely everything on the wire of your communications, and it's going through this third-party provider, and third-party provider is okay with giving this up, that would be your phone company, Verizon and AT&T. And by the way, they do that. There was a recent story on a program called Fairview, which described the AT&T cooperation in the New York Times. I would encourage you to look that up. Again, that's Fairview. Metadata in the simplest context, again, means activity records. It means what you did, where you went. It's everything that a private eye would notice if they were following you around. They can't sit right behind you every time you go to a cafe because you'll probably notice who is this creepy guy that's behind me all of the time who's leaning in over my table. So they're not going to hear every word you see or words you say, but they are going to see where you go, when you go there, who you go there with, how long you were there. Metadata now can be collected electronically, invisibly, and automatically on every person without targeting it. That's really the problem. Because now the creepy guy is your iPhone or your Android phone sitting in your pocket. Right. The difference is that now we're subsidizing our own surveillance. But this was done without our knowledge and without our consent. We didn't know that this was being done. We weren't given an option to opt in or opt out. That knowledge was denied to us by our governments, and in concert with a few knowing corporations that you broke the story on in a program called PRISM, actually, which were some of the most trusted names in technology. Google, Apple, Facebook, Yahoo. All of these guys sort of got in bed together with the government and said, hey, without a warrant for everybody around the world who's not an American, you can give us a general warrant signed by the Attorney General. The British government refers to these as thematic warrants. They follow a theme. And the government says, you look like you might have foreign intelligence value, or you might be affiliated with terrorism or anything like that. They don't have to prove it. They don't have to take it into any court. The Attorney General says, if an analyst such as myself, sitting at the NSA, I actually did this, could write 140 characters, just like a tweet, into an NSA sort of search box, I could pull up all of your call records. I could pull up all of your internet records. I could see every email that you had sent in the last 3 to 30 days. Anything like that at the snap of my fingers, broadly, But if I wanted to get it actually from the companies, this isn't a new way, directly off of their servers, those companies would provide that fresh, right, straight off of their servers and hand that over to the government. And this has never been tested in a court, and it had never been, well, authorized by law in a way that the public understood. This, of course, coming under the FISA Amendments Act, Section 702, or FAA 702, if people want to look that up. But to get back to metadata very quickly, people go, you know, maybe it doesn't matter because it's not actually what I'm saying on the phone call, but that's not the case. The government actually considers metadata more valuable than content. The director of the NSA, former director, said, we kill people based on metadata. Former top lawyer of the NSA said, metadata tells you absolutely everything about somebody's life. If you have enough metadata, you don't need the content. Content being, of course, what you actually said on the phone or what you actually wrote in the email. And it's important just to understand how metadata can be used to reconstruct content. For example, metadata is your entire browsing history, right? Every website that you actually went to. And if I know you went to this website, this URL for this article, and they weren't encrypting those communications, even though I didn't intercept and store the copy of that article as it crossed the wire, I only got the web address. That's how the internet works. I can simply input the internet address, and I can read everything that you read. And, you know,
I had a question before, though, that I just want to make sure I bring it back to. Because I can't see the audience, but I just have the feeling that some of them are sitting there with their fingers over the delete key. I need to know the answer to this. Should they be worried about where they browse or things they say or people they associate with, given that the government has their whole social graph?
The real question here is, should we change our lives because the government has abused our rights, or should we change our government to respect our rights? I know where I stand on that. Thank you. Yes, everyone should be taking basic measures to protect their communications because we know that right now the government is not respecting our rights, right? You should be making, if you have a smartphone right now, if I could ask the people, yeah, thank you, just the mute there. If you have a smartphone right now, you should go to the App Store or the Android Store, whatever it is you use, and look for an app called Signal, like Signal to Noise, by a group called Open Whisper Systems. This is an open source program. It's completely free. It just uses your phone number for communicating with other people. All of your calls will no longer simply be going over the global communications network electronically naked. It'll be done in a secure manner that even Whisper Systems, the people who provide the software, cannot break. Now, there are a lot of sort of programs and things like that out there that say, oh, this is a secure messenger, and you go, oh, I'm fine, I use something like Telegram. Well, Telegram's not actually safe because Telegram, the company, in most cases, is storing copies of your messages that they say are encrypted on their server, and yes, this is true. Encrypted meaning they're sort of locked with a code, but they have the key that allows them to unlock those and provide them to a government or to use them for their own purposes. Now, they say they won't do that. Fair enough. But they can do that. And the question is, should we trust third parties to be responsible stewards of our rights if they've proven that they are not worthy of that trust in the past? Or should we begin enforcing our rights through verifiable means that basically rely on science, on physics, on technology, rather than black letters on a page of some licensing agreement or even a law? Because the law can't defend people, right? Those letters aren't going to jump off the page and protect your rights. People defend the law, and people also cast down the law when it no longer serves the purposes of a population or society or a nation or a planet. And this increasingly is, I think, the direction that we need to be pursuing.
So there's a bunch of people out there, I'm just guessing here, who say, well, I don't have to worry, I'm using Snapchat, the message is gone in 10 or 15 seconds. What do you say about that?
It's the same problem, right? For everybody who's using Snapchat for interesting photos, it's being deleted from that individual's phone, but it's passing through a server. You've got to think about sort of how the internet works, right? You've got your phone and you've got your BFF's phone, let's say that. How does it get from point A to point B, right? The two phones can't magically find each other directly all of the time unless you're using very particularized technologies that are fairly uncommon, decentralization of services. And this means that we've got client-server communications. What that means is these handsets, right, your phones in your pocket, your laptops on your desk, those are the clients. The company, Snapchat, that's the server. You send your message to Snapchat, and then they send it to someone else. Well, they keep copies of these messages, right, in many, many different cases. And they say, look, this is for protecting people or aiding law enforcement investigations or so on and so forth. But that means somebody else has the capability to abuse your trust, and you won't even know that it's happened. So these are general principles which people don't understand very well, and to be honest, they shouldn't need to. This is an outdated dynamic of an internet that was designed before we were aware that the network path that everybody's crossing all the time is hostile, that it's being used by intelligence agencies, not just the NSA. Let's say you trust the NSA. Let's say you love the NSA. Let's say you work for the NSA, right? You get a bonus from NSA. What about every other government, right? What about governments that you don't like, that you disagree with? What about the Saudi Arabian government, the Russian government, the Iranian government, North Korean government, the Chinese government, French government, Israeli government? Whoever you are afraid of, they have the same capabilities. It's cheap now. It's easy. This is not rocket science, right? You can get a couple smart grad students, and they can do this on a global level within the span of a year. You can get a single individual who watches some YouTube videos and do this to the network at your coffee shop or your dorm in a matter of hours.
I want to come back to secrecy, because secrecy is what you so spectacularly transgressed a couple of years ago, and the role that that plays in cabining off areas of debate from public discussion. Because I mean, the core value of freedom of expression, there are many of them, and the conference will be dealing with them, but the founding core value of the First Amendment was political speech. It was being able to oversee our own government. How does the secrecy interfere with that? But once you specify that, does that mean there can't be any secrets?
No, I don't think it means there can be no secrets. The question is, what is a secret? What must necessarily be secret because it serves the public good, right? What are necessary, sort of the bottom line foundational secrets? The movement of military troops in a time of active conflict, the name of every terrorist suspect who's under current and active investigation, right? Because we don't want to spook them and give them a chance to flee. But the broad powers and privileges that the government is using in our name and also against us are something that we must know as a basic principle of good governance and basic public policy. Because if we don't, our government has lost all of its legitimacy because it's strayed from its mandate. The American government is founded on the idea that all elected officials represent the people, right? They have a mandate based on championing our interests. They're carrying out our will. Simply, the government is founded on the consent of the governed. But that consent is only meaningful if it is informed. And if I could just sort of illustrate why this is such a problem. Let's say you really understand the importance of liberty in a society, right? That's what makes a society open. That's what makes a society free. We can't cordon off speech. We can't say you can't say that. We can't say you can't talk about that. We can't say that's a heretical idea. You can't do that form of research in ways that advance our understanding of society. Because what you do is you give negative ideas a chance to fester without being challenged. You create adherents to sort of radical ideologies who can operate in sheltered spaces, and we, sort of civil society, don't get a chance to develop our own arguments to counter them because we're sheltered from them, right? We don't see these things happening. And so you care about the Fourth Amendment or simply constitutional government. You go, look, we've got a government of enumerated powers. The government, the federal government, is allowed to do very specific things, and it should do these specific things to the best of its capability. But beyond that, those are powers that are reserved for the people or their states. But then we rewind back to before 2013, before sort of the revelations of that year, and we think, well, what did it actually look like in Congress, right? For people who are politically aware, who are participating, and who are trying to understand how to cast their vote. National security officials are made to swear an oath to tell the absolute truth, right? Not to mislead, not to parse words, but to tell the truth. And to not do so is an actual felony. And this is what it looked like.
So Ed?
Yeah,
We're
so-
not having any sound on our end.
I'm going to cut in here. Yeah, I'm going to cut in here. I
If
don't.
you could,
Let me just just say I'm pretty familiar with that clip. I don't think the audio came through. Senator Ron Wyden says, is there any form of information at all that the NSA collects on billions or tens of American national intelligence? James Clapper says, no, sir. And Wyden says, no, and he says, not wittingly. So that's the exchange. This is at a time when they were actually collecting all of the telephone data of all Americans.
that's correct. And so this creates sort of a
So this creates sort of a public policy point
where we go.
uh,
How do we direct our government
how do we
if we don't
direct
know
our
what it
government
is they're doing?
if we don't know what it is they're doing?
And I'd actually like to ask your
Right.
thoughts
I'd
on that.
actually like to ask your thoughts on that.
What should we do in that case?
What should we do in that case?
We should talk a lot to reporters. I mean, I actually do see my job as being part of the web of checks on that kind of government behavior. So I heard you once say that we can't debate the merits of our secret military moon base if we don't know that the moon base exists, and we don't know what we don't know, and that's why I think that people who work inside the secret establishment should always be willing to run what they're seeing at some point, past some threshold, through their own moral lens. So, you know, some things that were classified in the not very distant past were the abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib, very highly classified information. The use of torture in secret prisons, very highly classified. You know, not so many decades ago, human experiments using exposure to syphilis or to nuclear radiation to see how that would work. Those things were classified, and people they didn't swear an oath, but they signed a contract saying that they would not release them. And up to a certain point, or past a certain point, I think people should say, you know, that is actually not my preeminent value, is following the dictates of this contract. I mean, it's actually quite hard to decide what would be the general principles of whistleblowing when bad is bad enough that you're willing to break the rules. But there's got to be some point there, and honestly, I think that any government official who says, if it's got a stamp on it, I'm never going to speak of it, end of story, I think that person is not actually participating meaningfully in the debate about where to draw the line of secrecy.
If they are, they're at least doing so dishonestly. The way I looked at it when I was actually going through the process that you described,
You know,
I believe in the American government. I want it to be good, right? I want our country to thrive. I don't want to burn down the NSA, right? I don't want to burn down the United States. I love my country. But I want my country to live up to its own values. And I want my government to fulfill its promises that it made to the public. And when you reach a point where you see that the most senior members of government have become the ones that are the least accountable to the public, despite holding the most power over them. And they say to change this, to tell the public what we're withholding from them is to break the law. You have to ask yourself, to what do you owe a greater commitment? The law or to justice? And everybody has a point in their life, and a certain level of incivility or inhumanity that they can all tolerate, right? People make mistakes. Systems and processes aren't perfect. You turn away from inequality, you see the beggar on the street and you go, I can't do anything about that, or I'm not going to deal with that today, or it's just too much for me to handle. But there's also one step beyond, where you see too much and you're driven to action. And I think we all have a moral imperative to look for that point, to find that point, to know where it is, and to know when we have not just the right to take action, but the responsibility to do so.
So I know that at some point we're going to turn this over to questions from the floor. I think I'll ask one more if that works for everyone. Since we're at a university, I wanted to bring this to the university environment. So not so long ago, I went and gave a talk about NSA surveillance at Purdue University, and in the course of my talk, I showed some slides and put them up on the screen, and those included screenshots of certain documents that you had provided that explain what the NSA was doing. So here's one example of that. So it remains classified. It's a top secret slide, and in short, it's a bit of a hodgepodge here. But what it shows is that the NSA and its British counterpart were busting into the so-called Google Cloud to help themselves to everything in there that they wanted without using the legal process that was provided by the PRISM program that you spoke of earlier. So when I put these slides up, and when Purdue became aware of that, the university decided that it had to report this to the federal government because it had some professors and some facilities that were doing classified work, and they were therefore bound by the rules that restrict dissemination of classified information, and they deleted my whole presentation from their servers. And they canceled plans to leave the webcast up on an archive basis. And the University of California, as far as I know, also does classified work. And I wonder whether you have seen or thought about the problem of the expansion of the aegis of the NSA, the expansion of the federal government classified rules outside the government itself, and two places where freedom of information or freedom of expression is especially highly valued, such as college campuses.
The general challenge here is, what is the limit of influence that the state holds? To what do we owe the state? And these are all of the institutions within society. Does the state work for the people, or do the people work for the state? And to see increasingly academia being influenced by state surveillance agencies, right? And told what they can and can't research, what they can and can't publish, what they can and cannot discuss, is unprecedented in U.S. history, as far as I understand it. And yet we see these things, these trends increasing, and it's not just in the context of debate. Increasingly, we see agencies doing investigations work on behalf of the government. Carnegie Mellon University took a significant amount of money, it's understood, from the FBI or some branch of the federal government, a research grant, to attack the most important piece of privacy-preserving infrastructure in the world today, the Tor anonymizing routing network. It's designed to protect the personal privacy of activists, dissidents, journalists, to protect your communications. Well, the government said, we don't really like that. We want to be able to see what they're doing. So, hey, Carnegie Mellon, can you do something about this? They developed an attack. They actually used this attack, apparently without the review of the IRB. And they then saved all of the information that they collected from this, and they provided this to the FBI. And to this day, they refuse to comment about it. They say, hey, go talk to the FBI if you've got a problem with that. Now, I'm sure the research was really interesting. I'm sure it's really exciting, but they've never published it. They did work for the government. They classified it. They worked against people who believed they had some purpose of privacy. And this is not to say it was, for an unjust cause. Maybe this was for investigations into drug markets or, pedophiles or whatever. But the point is, the academia was subordinated to the desires of state surveillance agencies voluntarily. They accepted publication restrictions in a very real and lingering way. And when we combine this with your experience, seeing that, whether these are members of the administration or our faculty, saying, hey, we accept grant money from classified agencies, and they're going to take this away if we don't respect their classified rules. They're going to de-accredit us. You can't talk about this here. What kind of university can function at all if they pay even a moment's attention to the idea that you can't talk about this?
Right. I mean, honestly, it was a bit of a dirty trick. So it was a bit of a dirty trick just now, perhaps, to have put that slide up, because I'm now putting UCI to the test, whether it's going to feel in any way bound to slice out that piece of his music. I'll rely on all my sources in this room to let me know how that goes. And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to you there in the room to ask questions that students or other members may have asked.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you, Edward. This is Barry Siegel here. They took it away. Hold on. Thanks. It's Barry Siegel here. You're talking. There's a few hundred people in this room and a few hundred more over at USC. They have provided a whole lot of questions. I'm sure we won't get to all of them, covering a whole lot of different things. Edward, a couple of personal ones we'll start off with. What is your day-to-day life like? How are you doing? Would you do it again if you could go back in time?
I would do it again. I would definitely do it again. And I would have done it sooner. And this was an idea that actually arose out of a conversation that I had with Daniel Ellsberg, who revealed the Pentagon Papers back in the 70s about the Vietnam War, that showed the government had been lying routinely and comprehensively to the public to try to defend support from the war, despite the fact that the war was failing. And he said, if he could give any advice to an individual who was grappling with these issues today, he said, don't do what I did. Don't wait until it's too late, until the war has gone on for 6 years, for 7 years, for 8 years. Come forward when it matters. Come forward as soon and as forcefully as you can, when the public is still making up its mind about these things. Because if you do, you can save a war's worth of lives. And in my own experience, this applies beyond the context of war. It applies to every prerogative of government or institutions more broadly, because once they have sort of granted to themselves a certain authority, a certain power, they've said, hey, we really like being able to do this. They very quickly become accustomed to that power, even if it's not necessary, and it becomes entrenched. And it is far, far, far more difficult to get the government to give up a power than it is to prevent them from gaining it in the first place.
Under what conditions would you come back to the United States?
I've actually volunteered to go to prison a number of times in conversations with the Department of Justice. They have countered with, they won't torture me. I actually have that in writing from the Attorney General. And while I think that's a start, I think there are fair trial guarantees that everyone would agree are necessary, right? We don't want to create a system where we have whistleblowers serving as a deterrent to other whistleblowers. Now, there's, of course, plenty of valid criticism of me. People say they don't like the way I did this. They don't like the reporters that I work with. They don't like the news agencies that I work with. Or, they said maybe something could have gone wrong, despite the fact that now it's 2016. This happened in 2013, and no one has ever been shown to have died or has been harmed in any way as a result of these disclosures. People in the government counter that it could have happened. They said, well, something could have gone wrong. Maybe the next person will be less responsible than you were. And so because of this, we need you to go away for life or whatever. Or some even presidential candidates are saying, hey, hang this guy with a rope, because they want to act tough. But when we think about what that means, right, what's actually happening when you go, well, something could have gone wrong, that's not an argument against whistleblowing. That's not an argument against the whistleblower. That's an argument against the free press. That's an argument against journalism. What they're doing is they're shifting focus from talking about the concrete harms of their bad policy to talking about the theoretical risks of journalism. Well, I have news for them. We have a constitution in this country, and the First Amendment is first for a reason. If we do not have freedom of the press, right, if we can't say what we want, if we cannot print and publish what we want, we cannot have a voice and a direction and control over society. If every time someone wants to open their mouth, they have to think about what could go wrong, suddenly we become a very closed and very controlled society where people are no longer individuals that are grown from their own intellect. They are shaped by the crowd. They are concerned about the prejudice and observation of the people around them. And that may be many things, but the one thing that I would argue it is not is America.
So in what circumstances, if ever, can national security as a government interest trump freedom of the press or the public's right to know?
I think this one should go to Bart, at least first, Bart, because being our representative of the press here, you probably have the most sophisticated understanding of the space.
So the preamble to the Constitution, which starts with "we the people" and establishes the primacy of self-government, has 6 fundamental interests named in it. That'd be a good pop quiz for anybody who wants to try it in this room. One of them comes forth is to secure the national defense. It is one among several primary values that we're trying to protect in this country. And so I think what you have to say is that sometimes, not always, there can be a direct conflict between the interests of maximum security for ourselves and for our physical safety and the interests of holding our government accountable for the use of its powers. Now, lots and lots of times the conflict can be averted by looking at sort of a narrower way to, or an alternate way of protecting the desire to arm the people with information or the desire to protect a very narrow slice of the secret. But every now and then, an honest answer would say, we have to decide on an actual conflict. And these are really hard questions, but there are certainly things that I think impinge on our security, and that might be interesting to talk about in a newspaper story or in the kind of book I'm writing now. And I think the security interest should win. I've openly stated that there are things in the files that I've read about the NSA that I decided very easily I would not publish. There were some others that were quite hard questions. So, for example, it took me well over a year to decide what to do with a cache of material in those files that included actual intercepted content from people's emails and Facebook chats and so on. Because on the one hand, they demonstrated better than any other information I had the breadth of the surveillance and the amount of non-relevant information that was captured and stored and very personal about people's lives. On the other hand, it was very personal about people's lives, and so there were privacy interests, and also there were real bad guys in there. And it wasn't going to be really easy for me to figure out what the consequences would be of publishing any part of it. And that took months and months of work and a lot of conversations back and forth with the U.S. government. I'm prepared to hear specific, legitimate reasons why publication of a particular fact would do harm. And if I don't have an essential reason to publish it, I will hold that back. Here's an example of a harm that I did not accept as a harm, and it was in the very first story. It was the story about PRISM. It was the story of that PRISM, the acronym. It was a story about the U.S. government being able to obtain information from the servers of 9 big internet companies. And the government said that the thing it very most wanted me to withhold from that story, the thing it thought would do the most harm to our national security if I published it, was the names of those companies. And I said, how could that be? Why? They said, because if you publish the names of the companies, they will not want to cooperate anymore. And I said, well, in that case, that's why I'm publishing it, not because I want to stop the program, but if your argument is that the people will not like what you're doing and will thereby, using either their ballots or the votes of their commerce or where they decide to create an account, are going to stop going there because they don't like what you're doing, then it's the essence of accountability that they should be armed with that knowledge. And so I did publish the names of those companies.
If I could actually add on to that, because that is a central point about the national security argument, and it is a serious argument. It's also very important that we question the use of that language. We recognize that because it is an extraordinary power, it should be used in the most sparing, most restrictive manner. Government today sees sort of terrorism as a magic word to get any law passed, to justify any sort of violation of rights. And this is actually the same as it's always been throughout history. When we look at things, for example, like Martin Luther King Day just passed, when they say national security, we need to think about what that means. 2 days after Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, the FBI for the first time declared him a threat to national security. And it wasn't just the FBI, the NSA did the same thing. And you know, some people like to think, oh, well, this is just Hoover, right? This is just back in the 70s. We don't do that anymore. Well, it actually is still happening today, right? Anything that the government sees as a potential radical or destabilizing force, they regularly infiltrate, they monitor, they try to subvert, and they try to stop because they see it as a threat to internal stability. And this has been from the days of COINTELPRO far throughout today. And whenever you hear the words sort of national security, I just want you to remember that 2 days after Martin Luther King gave his speech, he was now a threat to national security.
Do you think every one of the hundreds of people who have access to classified information should be free publicly to disclose that information whenever they think that would be good for the nation? If not, in what circumstances should they be free to do this?
So whistleblowing is the means of last resort. This should never be something that, you know, people just go, oh, it's classified, let's throw it out there. But I will counter, because this is actually a common criticism, and on the surface it seems quite persuasive, because we go, oh, it'll be anarchy. It'll set the precedent that we'll just have wild leaks. People will start using leaks to either support or attack policies that they don't like. But that is the status quo today. If you open any newspaper in any part of the world on any given week, there's a high likelihood that you will see classified programs being discussed on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, followed by said anonymous officials. And I think Bart could quite strongly support this. It is very common that we have this culture of impunity for leaks that the administration likes, that supports sort of its political preference. And we have an extraordinary and exceptional punishment of leaks that it dislikes. And even in the case where the leaks are not officially approved, where they do not serve the interests of the government, for example, recently General David Petraeus, he kept above top secret information, so-called black books that had special access program information on them from his time as a general, that included the most highly classified information, information about the president's thinking and deliberation on matters of policy, his plans and intentions, how to decide certain issues. He took this and he shared it with his biographer secretly, who he was sleeping with, to get more favorable treatment. And he was eventually charged, which in itself was extraordinary. Had this been a normal line worker or an average individual, they would have gone to jail for a very long time, possibly the rest of their life. Do you know how long General Petraeus went to prison for? Not a single day. Instead, he was fined less than he'll make in the span of a single speech. This is why we need to think about the fact that there is no precedent that we're risking setting by recognizing that sometimes matters of public interest will be leaked by individuals, and sometimes it will be done irresponsibly. It's done irresponsibly every day, and the government does not punish it. At the same time, when the public interest is clearly and demonstrably served, in certain cases, even if it did happen contrary to law, this is why we have exceptional powers built into our methods of government. This is why the president has powers of clemency, powers of pardon, is to recognize that, yes, we don't want to get rid of this law, yes, we don't want to set a precedent, but we recognize, for example, in this case, the laws have been changed as a result of the disclosures that happened in 2013. Courts have ruled them, these programs, unlawful, likely unconstitutional. Some even discuss them as Orwellian. The United Nations declared them a fundamental violation of human rights. Even in the United Kingdom, these laws are being changed and revisited as a result. We saw that rather than British intelligence using these powers to target terrorists, in some cases they were using them to spy on Amnesty International. And these are things that the government may not like the public to know, and may be concerned with people at the working level realizing that they can actually do this and it can have a positive benefit. The solution to this is not to be sort of more draconian and to crack down. It's to fix the policies and be more responsible in the first place, because whistleblowers don't do it for the money. They don't do it for the fame, because they never get it. When you look at the case of Thomas Drake, when you look at anyone who has blown the whistle in the public interest, for example, myself, I live in exile now. I was making extraordinary amounts of money working for the government for very little effort. And by the way, I don't have a high school diploma. Everyone in the room is more qualified than I am. But I was making far more than six figures. I had a beautiful home in Hawaii, and I left all that behind. Now I live in Russia where it's snowing, right? I don't mind that because now I can sleep. But to think that we have to deal with a moral hazard, to think that there's some ethical danger that we have to head off, or risk of anarchy, leaking is already happening on an unauthorized and uncontrolled systemic basis today. The only difference is, rather than serving the public, it serves individual officials.
to combine two questions here because they're along the same lines. What advice do you have for college students who are becoming cynical about the government's doings and limiting their ability to instigate meaningful change? And another question goes along with that. What can ordinary citizens do? Write articles, start a club, come visit you in Russia?
I think the first thing is to recognize, there's this big debate that the mainstream media, sort of the broadcast media, really likes to push. They like to distill all of the talk about the issues and get it out of the way, and instead talk about the personalities. They like to talk about, for example, me. And they go, is he a hero? Is he a traitor? Pick your side, pick your team, red team, blue team. Let's talk about that instead of what's actually going on in the government and how we're going to live in the future. I think the issues matter a lot more than people, but people are attracted by the personalities, by the narratives. That's what gets their attention, which is why the media does that. But for every individual in the room, I want to caution you about the danger of believing in heroes. I don't like the word hero. A lot of people say, hey, you're a hero. And I say, thanks for your support. I really appreciate that. But it actually makes me uncomfortable because I'm not a hero. I'm not a traitor. I'm just a citizen. The only thing that distances me from you are our decisions. And every individual is no farther than a single choice away from radically reshaping the direction of their life. And if they do it in the right way, in a positive way, the direction of society. So I would see the very first step in thinking about how you control your government is thinking about the world that you want to live in, where it should go, what it should be like, and think about what you can do to create that world directly. This is not an argument against, representative democracy. It's not saying, down with the system, everybody's got to be anarchists. And it's also not saying that sort of voluntarist individual action is not useful either. It's actually saying both. It's saying the government has a good role. It has things that it can do well. But there are also things that can only be achieved by individuals and groups and organizers. There are some things that can only be reached by protesters. And ultimately, the battle of policy is won through the battle for culture. If we change minds, we change laws. Think about where that should be and how you can do it.
Since you have been exiled, do you think there are others who have information they want to leak but have been discouraged? What would you say to would-be leakers?
Well, first, I don't know if he can answer this, but Bart actually, as a sort of a working journalist, I think would be well placed to ask or answer the question of, are there people out there who want to come forward, or you think maybe are less likely to come forward, or you heard from other colleagues? Is there any sort of concern or division or tension there?
Well, that's interesting. Long before I met you, I had become concerned that the government is now so good at detecting leaks that my traditional promise that I'm going to protect the confidentiality of our conversations was less and less meaningful. If we're all leaving this big trail of digital exhaust and the government can pluck names out of that exhaust easily and secretly and without my knowing it, because the government treats so many of these unauthorized disclosures about matters of defense and foreign policy as counterintelligence investigations, and therefore makes use of the most intrusive tools, that I was going to have to be working much harder to make it harder for them to do that. And so I have now had to learn and spend a lot of time and effort on the tradecraft of counterintelligence, of keeping my secret notes and my confidential contacts with people secure. And so if you were to go to my website, I'm not going to pitch it here, but or my Twitter feed in the profile, I've got secure contacts prominently displayed. And there are now means of communicating with me that are very, very hard to detect and intercept. And if it were not for that, there are people I know for sure I would not be talking to.
I will say, because he won't, his Twitter is at Barton Gellman. My Twitter is at Snowden. The thing to remember is if you access things like that from a work network, from anything that's associated with your name, even if you do everything after the fact, completely secretly, anonymously, you can betray yourself at the very beginning by, for example, you're sitting at work and you see something that's wrong that really bothers you, and you look up journalists. You look up their names, you look at their stories, you go to your favorite journalist's website or something like that, and you click on the Contact Me page just to get their email. You write it down, you take it home. You never write anything from work, but you looked at it from work. And then 6 months later, when the investigation comes through, because there's a front page story out that embarrasses the company or the government or whoever it is, they go back and they look at those logs and they see you went to Twitter/Barton Gellman or whatever, and Barton Gellman published a story. That's circumstantial evidence, but it's going to get your name really highly escalated on the suspect list very quickly. So you do need to be conscious of those things. Now, at the same time, let's look at what happened in 2013. The NSA was engaged, and still is today, engaged in the bulk collection, the indiscriminate collection of everyone's communications without regard to criminal suspicion or any wrongdoing. And yet, here I was, working at the NSA, in the NSA, where they're really supposed to know this stuff. And I was able to take evidence of actual criminal activity, things that have now been established were in violation of the law, and get them to journalists, and they didn't actually know about it, know what happened, until the journalists called them for comment on the story. So yes, it is difficult. Yes, it is dangerous. Yes, a lot of things can go wrong, but it can be done. If you think about things, if you are careful, if you plan, and if you are willing to sacrifice to achieve your mission of returning information to public hands that should have been published or been public all along, you can do it. You can win.
Well, is there government information that should not be disclosed? If so, what and when?
Yeah, I think we already touched on that briefly, but there are things that are pretty uncontroversial. Again, the names of active targets under surveillance who are known to be associated with violence, who are engaged in like active operational planning activity. You know, if we're 3 days from getting bin Laden or something like that, and then somebody says, hey, bin Laden's right here, and it's on the newspaper, obviously that's going to be an indicator to that target. There are also big vulnerabilities and things like that. This is a common argument that we shouldn't know. For example, if there's a way to take down an airplane from inside the airplane, you wouldn't necessarily want people to know about that. At the same time, we see this in the information security context of systems that everybody relies on. Recently, Android phones had a major vulnerability where someone could send a specially engineered text message that would take over your phone. Now, this is a serious security flaw. But until it was revealed, the vendors knew about it, the public was aware, and everybody kind of lost their minds over the vulnerability of it, it wasn't fixed. Things that could represent a real threat, for example, you know, talking about airplanes, ways they could be taken down, are a real vulnerability. And we should be careful, and we should be nervous, and we shouldn't sort of tend toward disclosure there. But that's not to say that even if secret information is disclosed, that it will cause real and irreversible harm. In fact, it could cause a prolonged good by suddenly getting all of the airlines in this example to go, hey, we need to look at these planes, we need to change them, we need to fix them to close that weakness, to remediate that vulnerability. And this is something that we need to understand, is when we talk about sort of the powers of classification, we're talking about potential risk, we're not talking about guarantees. The methods for classification, the actual standard that you have to meet to classify a document on paper, there are 3 tiers of classified information. There's confidential, secret, and top secret. Confidential is the disclosure of it will cause serious damage to the national security of the United States. That's for a single document. For secret information, grave damage, as in people will die, right? True gravity, like referring to the graves in the ground. Grave damage. Top secret will cause exceptionally grave damage. Each time a single document comes out, people are going to die for secret or top secret. That's how it's supposed to be. The case of Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks, circa 2009. 250,000 classified documents were revealed, largely in full and unredacted, at the secret level. A single one of those should have cost life or caused, some extraordinary grave damage. And yet 250,000 of them were released. And at the trial of Bradley Manning, the prosecution did not move to show a single individual had been harmed or killed as a result of those disclosures. Now, Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning though, got 30 years in prison as a result of those disclosures, despite the fact that the government could not show concrete, distinct, and individualized harm. And so this raises the central question of, these are possible risks, but when we see that they can be sort of transgressed in such extraordinary ways, again, this is not one document that came out, but huge, gigantic, portions of these en masse, and it doesn't really seem to cause real harm. Is it a question that we're just that good that nobody can harm us, in which case why are we so concerned? Or is it the case that we are overestimating the danger of public knowledge of things? And I think in the context of many of these, it comes down to the time for which material should remain sensitive. In many cases, these documents they were properly classified as secret, but they would no longer be sensitive or secret, again, after the military moves. When you're charging over the hill, you don't want anybody to know you're coming for the hill. But once you've taken the hill, everybody knows you're there because it's on the news. The fact that you're planning to go to that is not really that sensitive anymore. These are things that we need to be aware of. Yes, there are true secrets that we do need to protect. But in fact, I think there is a greater threat to society from the over-classification of information than from periodic leaks. And we now have a fairly extraordinary and unprecedented public record that supports that.
We're running out of time. We'll close with one more question for Edward. How do you want the American people to remember you?
I don't. And I really mean what ultimately matters are the issues, right? I've said this before. Everybody's like, hey, this guy, let's talk about this guy. I'm not so important. I was simply the mechanism of disclosure. Yes, we want to encourage people. We want to protect people who take risks on behalf of society. We want to pass better whistleblower protection laws and things like that. But I, as an individual, simply do not matter that much. If you want to look for people who really did the public a service, look to the journalists who actually brought this to you, who fought with their editors to get better versions of the story. When the government said, if you do this, you're a criminal, you've got blood on your hands, you're risking the lives of this, that, and the other. And they said, we've heard your argument, but we don't find it convincing. We think it's more important that the public know and they make up their own minds. That's what you should remember. We have a free press for the reason, and we should always defend it.